I am heavy weapons guy.
Germa versus Star,
I am the rocket man they talk.
It's no secret that TF2's golden age is long behind us. The years that followed this game's launch were filled to the brim with content updates, blog posts, SFM movies, comics, and so on. The sheer amount of love and passion that Valve put into TF2 was, in retrospect, pretty insane. Which makes the current state of the game all the more baffling. It'd be one thing if TF2's development had simply slowed down over time. And for a while, that's all it was. Taking a look at the timeline, there's a clear gradual decline in the number of major updates per year. But following 2017's Jungle Inferno, Valve just stopped. The passion Valve once had for this game seemingly vanished overnight, as TF2 has still not received another Valve-made content update in the over 2,000 days since Jungle Inferno. Something must have happened. Something must have made Valve suddenly pack up their bags and leave one of their most beloved IPs on life support. It'd be easy to point fingers at Jungle Inferno itself. Or maybe it was 2018's Blue Moon update, the last update to have any balance changes. And while these two updates certainly contributed to Valve's apathy towards TF2, neither were the catalyst for it. As the saying goes, Rome didn't fall in a day. TF2's current predicament is the culmination of several major missteps by Valve over the course of several years. But unlike Rome, the moment that TF2's fate was forever sealed can be narrowed down to the day, July 7th, 2016. Otherwise known as the release of the Meet Your Match update. An update that undermined everything that had previously made TF2 great. An update that made even the most dedicated players lose hope and abandon the game in droves. An update that we're still suffering from the consequences of to this very day. But in order to comprehend how a single update could do all of this, we need to go back to the start. We first need to know how TF2 lived to understand the day that it almost died. TF2 was officially released to the public on October 10th, 2007, and upon its release, it was a very different game from the one we play today. Now, most of you are already aware of the mechanical differences. There were no unlockable weapons, Pyro didn't have air blast, NG couldn't move buildings. But I'm not talking about the lack of things that would later be added. The way you played the game itself was radically different. There were no Valve servers. If you wanted to play TF2, it had to be on a player-run server, which meant you had to use the community server browser. This thing has, not aged well. But at the time, no one minded using it because server browsers were the standard for multiplayer PC games. Having a server browser was especially useful following TF2's launch because of the sheer variety the community servers offered. Some were vanilla. Some were mostly vanilla, but included custom maps into their rotation, and some were entirely unique experiences. Finding the server that was best for you took some trial and error. You'd check out a server from the browser and play for a bit, then add it to your favorites if you liked it, or blacklist it if you didn't. Eventually, you'd find your server, the server that you always defaulted to because you liked the maps they played on, or you liked the server settings. Or maybe you just liked the people that also played on that server. Of course, you couldn't always join your favorite server whenever you wanted. Sometimes they'd be full and you needed to wait for the autoconnect to put you in. This wasn't much of an issue because there was no shortage of other servers to hang out in while you waited. Once you did secure a spot onto your favorite server, you'd want to stay there for as long as possible, which meant occasionally enduring a match with unbalanced teams. But because people didn't leave the moment that teams looked unbalanced, there was plenty of time for the teams to, well, balance themselves, basically. Players were free to switch teams whenever they wanted assuming a spot was open, so skilled players could willingly join the losing team if they were bored and wanted a challenge. There were team scrambles, which typically happened automatically if one team was winning too much, but anyone could call a vote for one if it was deemed necessary. And yes, there was also the dreaded autobalance, a necessary evil for fixing teams with uneven player counts. Friends playing together would also be separated regularly. But this too was a necessity for keeping teams balanced. If you still play TF2 today, you know full well the power of the Discord called TeamStack, whether you've been part of one or on the receiving end of one. Back in the day of community servers, groups that were broken up couldn't simply hop onto a new server and immediately be on the same team again. This was frustrating to those that weren't trying to pub stomp, but even if you weren't on the same team as your friends, that wouldn't stop you from having fun in the same game together. The vibe of most community servers at the time was much more lax than Valve servers today. All talk being on was the norm, which gave matches the same energy as sitting in front of the TV playing Smash with your friends. Lots of banter, lots of yelling, and lots of laughs.
Get him, pussy! What the fuck are you doing? You're such a fucking... Oh my god, you're a spy!
Everyone, and I mean everyone, had their own server. If you wanted to zone out and play Dust Bowl or Two Fort all day, there was a server for you. If you wanted to play to win and trash talk, there was a server for you. If you wanted to not even play the game and just hang out, you better believe that there was a server for you. Community servers gave players immense freedom. You chose where you played, who you played with, and when you played. However, such freedom came at a cost. There was very little in the way of quality control, so it wasn't uncommon to stumble upon servers that forced you to watch obnoxious ads, or ones that gave game-altering benefits to donators. Then there were servers that lied about player counts or ping to trick you into joining them. And then there were the servers that were just garbage. Like, whatever this is. If you wanted to play TF2, you'd have to sift through at least some of these servers as you built up your favorites list. Even if you were lucky and never encountered the outright malicious servers, it could still feel like a chore cycling through servers when you were new to the game and didn't even know what type of experience you were looking for. Community servers were at their peak throughout TF2's first few years, and although they were great, you couldn't fully enjoy them the moment you first booted up the game. It took time exploring the browser and trying out different servers, time that new players were willing to spend because they'd just shelled out $20 for the game. That all changed with the Uber update of 2011, when TF2 went free to play. With zero prior announcements or warnings, there was suddenly a massive influx of new players that the pre-existing community servers could not keep up with. And these new players were unlike anything the community had seen before, because they were utterly, hopelessly clueless. When you buy a game, you don't do so on a whim. You'll watch some trailers or gameplay videos or read some of the reviews, meaning that you'll already have some idea of what the game is about should you decide to buy it. When a game is free, however, why waste time doing any research when you could be trying it for yourself right now? The moment this update dropped, there was strong resentment towards these free-to-play players from those who had purchased the game. Putting aside the fact that they'd spent money on something that was just made free, their favorite servers were now significantly harder to get into than before. Even if they did make it in, they'd be playing in a match where half the players didn't know what the objective was. Maybe they'd never even played a first-person shooter before. Maybe TF2 was the first PC game they'd ever played, and they were only now learning how to move and aim. The hatred towards free-to-plays was so strong that many server owners quickly developed and rolled out plugins that automatically kicked any accounts that hadn't purchased the game. It was bad. Had Valve not anticipated this knee-jerk reaction from the community, TF2's transition into a free-to-play game would have failed. The vast majority of newbies coming into the game would have been bullied off by the veterans. Thankfully, Valve had in fact prepared a solution ahead of time, but it was one that marked the beginning of the end for community servers. The Uber update, alongside making TF2 free-to-play, also saw the launch of Valve servers. At first glance, these were indistinguishable from any other community server. They even showed up on the server browser and could be joined from there. But what made Valve servers unique was that they were 100% vanilla. No plugins, no custom maps, no ads, and no moderators. Just regular 24-player TF2 on official TF2 maps, perfect for the hordes of fresh installs to flock to. And that seems to be enough to keep everyone happy. At least for now. Veterans would continue playing on their favorite player-run servers, while the noobs played on Valve servers. TF2's transition into a free-to-play game was a bumpy one, but Valve stuck the landing. However, this wasn't the only major transformation that Valve had in store for TF2. By 2011, TF2 had already been out for 4 years, and industry standards were beginning to change. Online multiplayer was spreading beyond PC and into console games, which were dropping the old clunky server browsers in favor of something called matchmaking. No more sifting through crappy player-run servers or waiting to get into one you actually liked. Instead, the game would quickly put you into a server itself with the press of a single button. This was incredibly convenient. Matchmaking seemed to be the future of online multiplayer, and Valve didn't want TF2 to feel like a relic of the past. So, in addition to TF2 going free to play and in addition to Valve servers, the Uber update also introduced an entirely new way of finding matches: quick play. Rather than needing to use the server browser, players could simply choose the game mode they wanted, click play now, and be put into a server automatically. Voila! Matchmaking. What was great about quick play was that it searched for community servers alongside Valve ones. There were some restrictions on which community servers would be eligible, more on that later. But basically, if you ran a vanilla server like Valve's, quick play would find players for you. Now, what sucked about quick play was that it searched for community servers alongside Valve ones. All those crappy predatory servers were fair game, and common sights for those that used quick play. That's not even mentioning the times quick play would put you in a server that was empty, or from the other side of the globe. There seems to be a lot of nostalgia for quick play nowadays among those that were there to experience it. And while I don't want to discredit anyone's feelings, quick play sucked. It just sucked. Most people at the time were aware that it sucked too. I think this Reddit post from 2013 sums it up best. If you're using quick play, don't. But what didn't suck about quick play was what it represented: a primitive form of matchmaking that wasn't separate from community servers. It had no shortage of issues, but Valve would proceed to spend the next several years refining it. In July of 2012, Valve attempted their first ever lobby system for quick play, and hey, wait a second, they just copied MVM's lobby. Alright, well, development for MVM was wrapping up at around the same time, so I guess it only made sense. And if you know anything about MVM's launch, it should come as no surprise that quick play's lobby was equally as terrible, leading to Valve ditching it within a year. That was fine though. A functional lobby would have been nice, but it wasn't necessary. No, Valve's top priority for quick play was to take out the garbage, so to speak, the heaps of predatory servers that were still frustrating players. Back in 2009, Valve had developed a nifty algorithm for picking out the absolute worst servers based on how many players joined and instantly left, which they continued to use to decent effect. There were also those restrictions that I'd mentioned earlier, the ones that prevented certain servers from qualifying for quick play. Most of these restrictions were what you would expect. VAC anti-cheat must be enabled, no ads in the message of the day, no selling of gameplay advantages, and so on. But then there were things like random crits needing to be enabled, and no custom maps, restrictions that felt arbitrary and gatekept a lot of the most popular servers at the time out from quick play. As for the more sensible restrictions, many of them could be worked around since quick play eligibility ultimately relied on a policy of truth, meaning servers could just lie? In which case players would have to report those servers to Valve for them to manually look into and delete. Indeed, the whole reason why that algorithm was created in 2009 was to give Valve data that servers couldn't lie about. Eventually, Valve had enough, and in January of 2014, they did what was considered by veterans at the time to be the final nail in the coffin for community servers. Quick play would now search only for Valve servers by default. Players could opt out of this by unticking a checkbox, but remember, most of the people that used quick play were the clueless newbies. They didn't understand what that checkbox meant, so they left it on. And most community servers needed that constant supply of fresh blood to stay populated during the off hours. Now, all the regular users would check their favorites list, see a bunch of 0 out of 24s, and not bother joining. Even if there were 10 of those regulars eyeing the same server at the same time, more than enough to get the ball rolling. All they saw was that there were 0 players actually connected to the server. That's what quick play, for all of its faults, was great for, filling up servers enough for the others using the server browser to hop onto. But with this change, the majority of player-run servers would either be completely full or completely empty. You're gonna have to wait to play anything resembling a game, and good luck playing with friends. At that point, Why even bother when there was always a Valve server to hop onto? When the Uber update launched and in the months that followed, Valve servers had a stigma of being for noobs only. But as those months turned to years, players that had once populated community servers found it more convenient to play on Valve servers. There was always a Valve server to play on, a server that was guaranteed to be 100% vanilla. To that end, why care about community servers anymore? It sounds like Valve servers were objectively the best way to play. Two things. First, the exclusivity of community servers, where you had to wait to get into the good ones, was a powerful tool for game balance. Remember how players would endure one-sided stomps, which gave the server time to balance things out? Well, if you were losing on a Valve server, you had no reason to stay, which would make the game you were abandoning even more of a stomp. It's possible you were only losing in the first place because someone else on your team had abandoned the server in hopes of finding one where they were the one stomping. Second, there was the issue of cheaters. Community servers not only had VAC, but they could also get additional security from plugins made from other community members. Even if a cheater managed to get into the server undetected, a mod could ban them instantly. Valve servers, on the other hand, only had VAC, which is to say they practically had nothing. Players could vote to kick cheaters, but unless they were being blatantly obvious, it was more convenient to abandon that server and hop into another, rather than try convincing the rest of your team that someone was cheating. There were, of course, more subjective reasons why Valve servers could be seen as a downgrade, like the sense of community being lost and there being less eyes on community-created content. But to the players who hadn't experienced community servers in their former glory, who by now made up the majority of the player base, the death of community servers was met with a resounding eh. Veterans, on the other hand, could see the writing on the wall, yet they were powerless to stop it. So by 2014, the era of community servers was officially over. But while community servers continued to decline, there was a completely separate group of players who were not only surviving, but thriving. TF2's competitive scene sprouted as soon as the game was released, with leagues like TF2L forming within TF2's first month. Interest in competitive was inevitable, given that TF2 was a shiny new FPS, but there already being an established player base moving in from Team Fortress Classic certainly didn't hurt. This game was very different from Team Fortress Classic, however, so the first few months were spent figuring out the ideal format and rule set. Ideas were pitched, polls were run, arguments were had. But everyone could agree on one thing. They would not be playing the same version of TF2 as everyone else. 12v12 would be a nightmare to organize and impossible to spectate. Eventually, 6v6 was decided upon. Random crits, unsurprisingly, would also be turned off, and maps like 2Fort would quickly be cycled out. Then came the topic of class limits. Competitive TF2 wouldn't feel very competitive if you had to fight 5 engineers on last, or 3 heavy medic pairs. There was also Demo, whose damage output was disgustingly high for reasons that we'll get into later. Alright, so class limits of 1 for Demo and Medic, and limits of 1 or 2 for everyone else, depending on the league. All of these restrictions were necessary to steer TF2 away from its intended slower-paced gameplay focused on team pushes and towards a more fast-paced DM-focused one. And that's exactly what this new format, dubbed Sixes, was. Fast-paced with a heavy emphasis on movement and skill. You know, when it didn't stalemate at least. However, as a consequence of these restrictions, class and weapon balance would look very different in Sixes than in the 12v12 version of TF2 that most people played. That was fine though, because the entire format was balanced around TF2 at a stock level. So when Valve started releasing unlockable weapons in 2008, competitive leagues could just ban any that they felt were uncompetitive, and only allow the unlocks that further raised the game's skill ceiling. It can be easy to criticize these leagues for being too ban-happy, and that criticism isn't without some merit. But banning things is par for the course for games that were never designed to be competitive. Competitive Smash bans items, stages, strategies, and even characters. Competitive Pokemon limits some overpowered mechanics and bans other ones. To reiterate, competitive TF2 was a very different version of the game. This meant that some unlocks might be balanced in 12v12 but broken in 6v6. The solution was to ban that unlock and to be done with it. 6s was balanced around launch TF2. They could ban every unlock in the game and it wouldn't matter. 6s would still be 6s. They just needed the stock weapons. And the stock weapons were, well, they were stock. They were never gonna change. As the years passed by, the competitive scene continued to grow and evolve. Unlocks like the gunboats and the Crusader's crossbow helped push the format to new heights, while players like Clockwork showed how TF2's classes hid within them even more depth than was previously thought. Alternative formats sprang up as well, such as Highlander and 4v4. For years following TF2's launch, competitive leagues continued to grow. More people were playing and watching. There were even international LAN tournaments throughout the early 2010s, where players from across the world would fly in to compete. One thing that never changed though was that TF2's competitive scene was 100% grassroots. It was run and organized entirely by the community with zero involvement from Valve. Valve was fully aware of the growing competitive scene and wanted to help whenever possible, but they viewed competitive and casual players as two entirely different markets, and their priority was always on the casual player base. For the most part, this philosophy was fine. Valve was happy to make small changes that didn't affect casual players, like creating more server options to streamline running a competitive server. Where this became an issue, however, was with balancing. TF2 being perfectly balanced around both casual 12v12 and competitive 6v6 is a pipe dream, but that sure didn't stop Valve from trying. One update did change something to appease competitive players at the frustration of casual players, like when Heavy's rev speed was buffed. Then, in another update, they'd change something else to appease the casual players, to the confusion or further frustration of the competitive scene, like when they nerfed the extinguisher when it was only really broken because of the degreaser. They'd release an unlock that was explicitly for competitive players, spawned from a closed beta with competitive players, only for competitive leagues to unanimously ban that unlock. They were right to, by the way. The original GRU was insane. And then there were changes that I don't even know who they were for. Like, why did they nerf the sticky jumper? Casual and competitive players alike were in a constant state of confusion, wondering if Valve even played TF2 anymore. Valve viewing these types of players as two separate entities was only causing more and more frustration. Something had to change. In the summer of 2013, competitive players met with the TF team and Robin Walker himself to discuss the future of competitive TF2. Based on a recounting from one of the players that met with the team, Valve wanted to do more for competitive players, but the issue was that both 6s and Highlander were too different from pub play. Valve simply didn't have time to ship content that only a small subset of their customers would use. Bridging the gap between competitive and pub play would solve this issue. That way, future updates could be enjoyed by both sides. However, it wasn't clear how that would be done. The idea of an in-game competitive lobbying system was thrown around, but it would have been a variation of Highlander with a pick-ban item system. Robin Walker's issue with 6s, and to a lesser extent Highlander, was that the meta was too stale. He'd stopped watching competitive TF2 because there were no more sick new strats to see. Valve as a whole was very much against the idea of banning weapons outright for this reason. As for the proposed pick-ban system, it would have given Valve useful and objective data to use for weapon rebalancing that they otherwise lacked. If 95% of players voted to ban a weapon, that was a pretty clear indication that people playing TF2 competitively hated fighting it, and that Valve should re-examine it. Ultimately, this proposed system never surfaced, and so Valve continued to struggle keeping the game balanced for all levels of play. This would come to a head in the Love and War update of June 2014. So remember how I'd mentioned Demo's disgusting damage output? Back when the game first launched, Demo stickies had the same 150% damage ramp up as most other weapons, allowing them to potentially deal up to 180 damage each. This absurd ramp up was scaled back significantly in 2009, leading to stickies only dealing around 140 damage maximum. Over in the 6s community, no one considered raising the Demo class limit above 1 for even a second following this nerf. The class still had 12 high-damage explosives between what are essentially two primary weapons. But Demo was fine in 6s because the whole format had been balanced around Demo being overpowered, in the same way that chess is balanced around the queen being overpowered. It's kind of Demo's job to be insanely powerful and dish out lots of damage, and each team only got one, while the standard lineup also included not one but two of Demo's biggest counter, Scout. Like with the queen, you were likely to lose your Demo if you didn't play carefully, which would put your team in a terrible position. Playing Demo outside of competitive, therefore, was like playing chess if you could use 12 queens. Yeah, casual players loathed sticky spam, and that hatred wasn't unwarranted. Even just 2 demos could lock down a choke and make it flat out impossible for anyone to pass, all by spamming M1 and M2. These complaints undoubtedly reached Valve, because in the Love and War update, the Sticky Bomb launcher was given what I consider to be the single largest nerf in TF2's history. As of this update, stickies would now suffer from a damage ramp up for the first 2 seconds. Most estimates put the ramp up at around 50%, leading to airburst stickies dealing as low as 40 damage each, even with perfect aim. This single change shook every competitive player to their core. In an instant, the competitive format that had been evolving and growing for 7 years was left in disarray. How should teams be playing around their demo now? Should they even be running a demo? Is the class limit of 1 still necessary? Now, this nerf alone was not the end of the world. It was insane, but had it stayed, competitive players would have adapted. It's what this nerf represented that pissed them off. That Valve could unearth the very foundation of their format for any reason and at any time, even 7 stinking years into the game's life. By 2014, competitive TF2 was still going strong, but the scene's popularity was beginning to plateau, with some feeling that it was already on the decline. Meanwhile, the competitive scenes in Dota 2 and CSGO were exploding in part because Valve was actively supporting their major tournaments, organizing massive community-contributed prize pools, or straight up funding the prize pool themselves. Competitive TF2 couldn't grow much further without that type of support. It was on the cusp of taking off, they just needed an extra push from Valve. And here they were, making massive changes that did nothing but hurt competitive. I can only imagine the hate mail that Valve received, because they'd revert the sticky nerf less than a week later. Valve would figure out a much more sensible nerf for stickies in December via a blast radius reduction that was reduced even further during the first 2 seconds of a sticky's life. Casual players were happy to see sticky spam be nerfed, and competitive players were relieved that well-aimed stickies still dealt the same amount of damage as before. That was not an experience that Valve wanted to relive. And this was 2014. Do you know how many unlocks were still broken in competitive, or in pubs, or both? The Wrangler, the Gru, the Enforcer, the Darwin's Danger Shield, the list goes on. This was a turning point for Valve. They were done trying to please 2 entirely different communities at once. They were going to bridge that damn gap, and they were going to do it their way. They were going to make their own competitive format. Work on Valve's very own competitive matchmaking began in the summer of 2014, immediately after the sticky nerf fiasco. Starting in August and throughout the next year, fragments of code would be found by players that indicated Valve was working on some sort of ranked matchmaking, with usage of the word competitive being of particular interest. At first, no one got their hopes up too much. There were always random projects that Valve started coding for but never finished, like code for a Spy vs. Engie update that was also spotted around the same time. Valve continued plugging away at their matchmaking, yet from an outsider's perspective, it was radio silence as usual, which, naturally, made competitive players very nervous. They had no idea what was going on, but their best guess was that Valve had no plans for supporting competitive, potentially letting the momentum behind the scene's growth fizzle out. Some of the most prolific players at the time came together and wrote a letter to Valve, basically just asking what was going on. Valve responded and asked those players what they felt Valve should prioritize to support the competitive scene's growth. The group of players ultimately listed two things as being top priority: an in-game list of streamers and in-game competitive matchmaking. Valve then invited this group to their headquarters in April of 2015, where they revealed that they had in fact already been working on matchmaking. Interesting note about this meeting, Valve at this point was still not sure what the ideal format would be, which was likely what caused the 2013 plans to go nowhere. Valve wanted their competitive to be as similar to pub play as possible, which made some variation of Highlander the clear choice. But Highlander would have also been a logistics nightmare. Matches of 18 players with exactly one of each class? Good luck putting together a balanced game in any reasonable amount of time. Valve expressed interest in adding a separate queue for Highlander later down the line, but for now, they had to swallow their pride and choose option B. Valve's competitive was going to be 6v6. Probably. Again, they were still working out the specifics, but at this point it was clear that they weren't turning back. In-game matchmaking was on its way. Word about this spread like wildfire, beyond competitive and into every corner of the game. Competitive players were, of course, hyped as hell, but so were many pubbers. Finally, a place to play without dealing with conga lines and teams of 5 spies. Even the most casual players were excited because it meant all the sweaty tryhards would have somewhere else to play. I must emphasize, however, that the vast majority of players were cautiously optimistic. The overhyped disaster that was the end-of-the-line update had happened just a few months prior. People knew to temper their expectations. They knew that matchmaking, whenever it came out, would likely have a rough launch. But, God, Valve is actually supporting competitive. They still care about TF2. That fact alone was enough to get excited about. Development for matchmaking continued throughout 2015. The major updates for that year, Gunmetal and Tough Break, reflected this, as they were jam-packed with balance changes. In November, players would uncover a new string of code titled mapcycle_ladder, which contained a list of maps that you'd expect from a 6's rotation. Badlands, Granary, Foundry, Gullywash, Snakewater, Two Forts, and Turbine. Yeah, that seemed pretty on brand for Valve. I'm sure those last two were just placeholders for testing. In any case, competitive matchmaking was coming. It was just a matter of when. Then, in January of 2016, a post was made on r/TF2 by none other than Jill, a known developer for TF2. It read as follows. Hey guys, we've set up a Steam community group for the TF2 competitive beta here. We'll be using this group to send out announcements related to the competitive beta, as well as seed beta invites for the expansion of the closed beta. If that sounds like a thing you need, get in here. Signed, the TF team. Did Valve just communicate? They know how to do that? And they're letting the community test out matchmaking before it's even out? This was unprecedented. Tens of thousands of players poured into the Steam group, with it quickly passing the 100,000 mark in just 1 month. Jill, who I should clarify is a guy, made a post on the Steam group in February outlining Valve's plan for the beta. They'd already been allowing top competitive players to test out matchmaking for the past 2 months. But as for everyone else, there were 2 ways to get in. First, Valve would announce stress tests via the Steam group, where anyone in the group could join. These typically lasted for a few hours, though some lasted several days. The second way of playing the beta was by obtaining a beta pass, an item that let you access matchmaking at any point. These would be randomly distributed to players in the Steam group starting in March. If you were lucky enough to get one, your beta pass would eventually spawn a second beta pass that you could give to a friend. Then that friend's pass would spawn another, creating a chain that could be repeated infinitely. The idea was for full-time beta access to spread over the next few months, until everyone who wanted one had one. You might be thinking, how could Valve possibly make sense of all the feedback they'd be getting if there were over 100,000 people playing the beta? Trust me when I say that the feedback they needed was made crystal clear to them. Whether they'd do anything with that feedback was another question. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The first stress test was done on March 1st, and wait a second. They just copy-pasted the MVM lobby again. Well, this was only a beta. Everyone going into it knew that it would be a little rough around the edges. The initial response to the beta was extremely positive. Thousands came to play, and the Steam thread that accompanied this stress test was filled with posts of people saying how much fun they had, how much of a breath of fresh air this was, how cool it was that Valve was doing this at all. That's not to say people didn't share any criticism, far from it. Aside from the expected bugs and overall lack of polish, the two most common complaints were the absence of class limits and the map pool, which still included 2 forts and Turbine. Also, Double Cross for some reason. Stress test number 2 rolled around 2 days later. Following the first test, there had been a handful of bug fixes, like one where people queuing for MVM would mysteriously appear in competitive. Gee, I wonder how that could have happened. Additionally, CTF maps were removed from the rotation. For now. Well, alright. Valve's actually listening. This is great. For each one of these tests, the feedback was the exact same. Lots of excitement, but also lots of constructive criticism on the same few points. There was the lack of class limits, which was a major complaint since day one. The lack of weapon bans was also brought up, but most understood that including every unlock gave Valve important data on which ones were being abused and needed to be rebalanced. Not having class limits though, there was no excuse for that. A universal class limit of 2 would have sufficed. Then there were the forced graphics. Regardless of your settings, if you entered a competitive game, you'd suddenly be blinded by shiny, high-quality models, ragdolls, explosions, and so on. Most competitive players disabled these for improved readability, and for some, they flat out needed low graphics to run TF2 without crashing. There were also cheaters, who couldn't even be kicked because it wasn't an option in competitive. Some worried about the lack of incentives, which would help retain higher player counts by giving players something to keep grinding for. But by far, the biggest grievance with the matchmaking beta was abandonment. Players, for whatever reason, would quit games constantly, sometimes at the start and sometimes right before it was over. The person abandoning the match would lose rank, but the team that was winning wouldn't gain any. It was clear from the very start that this beta had some major fundamental issues. As the stress tests continued, there were signs of improvement. Test number 7 introduced a TF2 specific report button to the menu. Test number 8 added the team status UI that we still see in matches today. And bug fixes were prevalent in every stress tests. But those fundamental issues were never touched. The test would continue on a regular basis until test number 9 on March 18th. Once that was done, there wouldn't be another for 3 whole months. During that time, Valve continued making small updates. On March 24th, they added the in-game Twitch list that competitive players had asked for. Most of these updates, however, were just more bug fixes. Like one in April where players would see the competitive mode doors at the start of MVM missions. Gee, I wonder how that could have happened. As the time after stress test number 9 increased, so did speculation surrounding the upcoming competitive update. There was a massive thread on Facepunch forums dedicated to predicting when TF2's next major update would drop and what would be included. Some talked about the beta, others argued over balance changes. One guy thought the next update was gonna be Nito. Wait, Jill? The Jill from Valve? Yep, there he was, spilling the beans about TF2's next update, in a thread dedicated to major updates. So that means... oh my god, it's coming. The competitive update was right around the corner. From this point on, the then unnamed update was referred to within the community as the Nito update. A few days after Jill's post, stress test number 10 was announced. The focus for this test was on a new late join system. If a player dropped before the match started, the queue would attempt to find a new person rather than immediately ending the match like before. Oh, thank god. So Valve is aware of the abandonment problem. That's a relief. For a second there, it was looking like they were just ignoring all of those fundamental issues I'd talked about earlier. Then, 2 days later, Stress test number 11. The final stress test. No additional changes were made, it was just the final stress test. Oh no. By test number 11, the beta had still not changed much since the first test back in March. There was a long list of bug fixes and some added polish, but all of the major issues from the start of the beta were still major issues now. The newly added late join system was a good start to tackling abandonment, but that's all it was. A start. There was still a lot of work to be done. And yet, the competitive update would be pushed out just 1 week later. July 6th. New blog post. The Nito update, now officially named the Meet Your Match update, was finally here. The post itself had the same witty, sarcastic tone that you'd expect from Valve, with them acknowledging that they were a bit late to this whole matchmaking thing. Day 1 revealed competitive mode, obviously, and 3 new maps: Sunshine, Metalworks, and Swiftwater. All 3 of these maps had already been permanent fixtures of competitive map pools, so Valve adding them in the competitive update was a nice gesture. So far, so good. Oh yeah, this was also the official debut of Pastime. That was this whole other thing that wasn't even being developed by Valve. Whatever. It was neat extra content, but everyone knew that competitive was the main focus here. Day 2. The Meet Your Match update was also the Meet versus Match update, where players could vote on which class would be rebalanced in the next major update, Heavy or Pyro. Then you got your standard taunts, cosmetics, a new stock melee reskin, even real-life merch. But enough reading about the update. With the reveal of Day 2, on July the 7th, 2016, Meet Your Match was officially out. And from this day forward, TF2 would never be the same again. After 2 years of development and months of beta testing, competitive mode was finally out. It felt unreal. The thing competitive players had been dreaming of for nearly a decade was right there in front of them. But aside from some added polish, the official competitive mode was no different from how it was at the end of the beta, which itself had barely changed since the start of the beta. All of those issues that beta testers had consistently brought up were still here in the final product. There were still forced graphics. There were still cheaters. There were still no incentives, and there were still no class limits. And all of these issues fed into the single biggest grievance with competitive: abandonment. When someone abandoned a match after it had already started, the match was over, and no one would gain any rank. Even if your team was seconds away from winning, you wouldn't get anything if little Timmy on the other team yanked out his Ethernet cord. Then it was right back to queuing, where you had to stare at the lobby screen that was still a blatant copy from MVM. Abandonment was always going to be an issue at the start, since so many people were trying the new mode at once. If someone decided mid-match that competitive mode wasn't for them, then they had no reason to stick around. There wasn't any reward to grind for. The only penalty for abandoning was a cooldown, which meant nothing to someone that didn't want to play anyways. But what if your match had a cheater in it? You couldn't kick them, so the match was effectively ruined. Why stay for that? What if your game ran at 20 FPS because of the forced graphics? What if you ran out of time to play because 5CP games can theoretically last forever, and the opposing team kept stacking Engie and stalemating every match? Since no one gained any rank from abandoned games, veterans continued to be pitted against fresh installs because the matchmaking saw them as being the same rank. Rank 1. And here's the kicker. Repeated abandonment punished you with increasingly long cooldowns. Makes sense, except the increased cooldowns wouldn't go back down over time. No, they only went down after completing games, something that wasn't happening very often. The process of playing competitive mode looked something like this. Stare at the lobby screen. Find a match, but uh-oh, someone's game crashed. Back to the lobby screen. Find a match. It's a one-sided stomp that's over in 2 minutes. Back to the lobby screen. Find a match. It's ruined by a cheater. Back to the lobby screen. At some point, you get fed up and abandon yet another match that had a cheater, or was a stomp, or dragged on forever. Repeat this process a few times and great, now you're locked out of competitive for an entire month, which meant longer queue times for everyone else that's still trying in vain to have fun. So it was practically impossible to find a competitive game and play it to completion. But let's say you got really lucky and managed to play a full match. Was it worth all the waiting and frustration? Not really, because Valve's competitive was nothing more than a glorified pub. This was partly due to all of the abandonments preventing anyone from rising the ranks. Even if you were a skilled player that should have been matched with other skilled players, the matchmaking had zero way of figuring that out. Teams were formed randomly, no different than in pubs, only there was no option to scramble or switch teams. It also didn't help with the pub comparisons that Valve Comp lacked any class limits or item bans. But wait, the items. This update came with balance changes, right? Surely Valve tweaked the problematic ones to make them more fair and competitive. After all, they had loads of data that they'd said they needed from the competitive beta. Well, credit where credit's due, teleporter cost dropping from 125 metal to 50 was a pretty awesome change, as was Spy's move speed buff. Medics copying their heal target speed with any medigun was massive, although whether this was a good change or a bad one is still up for debate. Most of the other balance changes, however, were varying degrees of confusing. There was the Widowmaker dealing 10% more damage on their sentry's target, or the Sun on a stick granting fire resistance when deployed, or the Enforcer piercing resistances. Like, okay, I can at least see the logic behind these, even if the execution is questionable. Then there were changes that had no logic behind them. The Buffalo Steak Sandwich of all things got nerfed, while the shortstop gained its now infamous useless shove. But there was one change in particular that drove the entire community into a frenzy, one that proved, without a shadow of doubt, that Valve did not play their own game. So, you know the Righteous Bison? That garbage soldier secondary that shoots lasers? Well, when it first released back in 2011, it was actually pretty good. And it was a well-known fact at the time that the Bison's projectile could hit the same player multiple times, meaning if someone was retreating, they'd take extra damage. That's why it was used. It was a good, fun alternative to the shotgun that punished players who tried to run away. There was even an in-game tip about it, which clearly states the Righteous Bison can hit the same enemy multiple times. Now fast forward to meet your match, where the Bison's mechanic of hitting the same person multiple times was removed. Huh, I wonder why. Did they think it was too powerful or something? Nope, it was listed as a bug. The mechanic that was objectively not a bug, but an intended feature, was removed because someone at Valve thought it was a bug. Let me tell you, this got people's blood boiling. And Valve didn't stop there, no. They nerfed the Bison even further by slowing down the projectile. With any other balance change, you can find some semblance of logic if you squint hard enough. But there is literally no explanation for this other than Valve not playing their own game. Valve's competitive was a flop, and it was entirely their fault. The community had told them time and time again what they needed to do to fix competitive, and Valve just didn't do it. It was a total rush job. But why? There was so much excitement behind matchmaking. Did Valve really sacrifice all of it just to get the update out a few weeks earlier? Well, remember how there was that long gap between stress test number 9 in March and stress test number 10 in June? Something kinda important happened during that time.
We are Overwatch.
Overwatch was first announced in November of 2014, and comparisons between it and TF2 were immediately drawn. Now, Overwatch wasn't the reason Valve started working on competitive, since development for that had already started a few months prior to Overwatch's announcement. But the threat of Overwatch undoubtedly hung over Valve's heads. Here was a colorful, class-based FPS that, unlike TF2, was already poised to become an esport due to its smaller team sizes and short, fast-paced matches. and all evidence at the time pointed to esports being the future of video games. One such example was Valve's own CSGO. Believe it or not, CSGO's player count was actually lower than TF2's for more than a year following its release. It was only after the first Valve-sponsored major in late 2013 that the player count surpassed TF2's and to the levels that we see today. To many, Overwatch was TF2 if it were an esport. It was TF2 for the modern era. So I can only imagine Valve's panic when Overwatch released to universal acclaim in May of 2016, when TF2's comp beta was nowhere close to being a finished product. Meet Your Match was rushed out in large parts because of Overwatch. I'm almost certain of that. After staring at the same lobby screen for hours, everyone who was initially hyped for this update shrugged their shoulders and stopped queuing. Matchmaking was supposed to close the gap between casual and competitive players. Yet, by the end of the day, most pubbers had already given up. Maybe they'd give it another shot if Valve was able to fix all of its problems quickly. But until then, they'd return to quick play just as they had been for the past few years. Wait, this isn't quick play? Let's rewind back to July 6th, day 1 of Meet Your Match, before the update was available to play. So there was the reveal of competitive, the new maps, pastime, but there was another addition that I didn't mention, casual mode. A second matchmaking system that Valve had been developing alongside competitive, one that would replace quick play. No one, and I mean no one, expected this. Some had speculated that a separate casual queue would be introduced alongside ranked, but the assumption was always that any matchmaking systems would exist alongside quick play. What made this even more of a surprise was that Valve continued to update quick play in the months leading up to Meet Your Match. Like when they added a new quick play category for alternative game modes in April, just 3 months before quick play would be removed forever. The initial response to casual was very positive actually. No more auto balance was huge, as was the promise of equally skilled teams. But then came July 7th, the same July 7th that had pushed out a broken, unfinished competitive mode, and the positive reception to casual immediately turned sour. TF2, as the player base had known it for the past 9 years, was dead. Whatever they were playing, if they were lucky enough to play it in the first place, was not TF2. The pure rage that resulted from this single day was unlike anything the game had seen before, and unlike anything Valve had ever experienced, I'd imagine. The player base, by and large, rejected casual. Players flocked to forums, begging and pleading for Valve to revert casual and bring back quick play. What on earth was going on? What could be causing such a vitriolic response? In short, casual was anything but casual. The freedom that players had enjoyed throughout the eras of community servers and quick play was forcibly removed from them. This was apparent before you even joined a game. You could not pick which maps you wanted to queue for. Some maps, by the way, like Gullywash and CTF Sawmill, were flat out missing with zero explanation. You couldn't even pick which game mode you wanted. You had to pick at least 2. Once you did, you waited, and waited, and waited. Queue times for casual were unreasonably long, regularly surpassing 15 minutes. Valve would later claim that these long queue times were the result of a bug, and that may have been partially true, but they had made several decisions that would also explain the long wait times. Games would only start once 24 players were found for a server, no less. The matchmaking system was also programmed to avoid filling in empty spots for existing games as much as possible. It prioritized finding a fresh game for everyone, which would obviously inflate queue times dramatically. This also prevented your friends from joining your game mid-match. They'd have to wait and join you in the next match. After finally getting placed in a match, you still couldn't play the game. Nope, you gotta sit around doing nothing for 2 minutes to give everyone time to connect, because God forbid the game starts before it's a full 12v12. Once the pre-round was over, you'd finally get the opportunity to play. And admittedly, the presentation for casual, like the doors at the start and the sign that says what round it is, was pretty cool. As for the match itself, casual was basically the old Valve pubs, but with less options. You couldn't switch teams. You couldn't vote for a team scramble. You couldn't spectate. You couldn't even call vote kicks, which led to cheaters having a field day with this update. Game after game ended in a one-sided stomp because Valve removed the tools community servers had been using to balance themselves out. This would have been fine if the matchmaking actually worked, but would you be surprised if I told you that teams were usually not evenly skilled? Remember how the convenience of Valve servers had taught players to leave the server and look for a new one if they were losing? That was still happening, but now that the matchmaker was so hesitant to fill empty spots, a few players leaving would quickly snowball into an entire team leaving. Turns out autobalance, as frustrating as it could be, was kind of important for this exact scenario. And once the match was over, bye-bye, back to the lobby for everyone. The server would forcibly eject everyone out. You literally could not stay. Like with competitive, leaving a casual match before it was over would punish you with a 10-minute cooldown. And like with competitive, there were plenty of valid reasons to abandon a match. What if there was a cheater? What if everyone else on your team had left and it was you against the entire enemy team? The only thing casual did that the old Valve servers didn't was waste your time. You wasted time staring at the lobby. Whereas before, you could hop around in community servers even while you waited to get into a full one. You wasted time with the pre-game timer, which was introduced with casual. You wasted time with an unfun, unbalanced game, and once that was done, your reward was getting to waste more time staring at the lobby screen. Meet your match? No, sorry, this is wait your match. If you were placed into a payload or attack defend match, you'd find that stopwatch mode was now enabled, a mode used in Highlander where a team could win by beating the other team's capture time, rather than needing to push the cart all the way to last or capping the last point. This was neat, but at the time, all it did was infuriate people even more because it just sent people back to the lobby even faster. Where were community servers during all of this? Dead. July 7th marked the true death of community servers not named Skyle. It wasn't the Uber update, and it wasn't even QuickPlay defaulting to Valve servers. Those two things hurt community servers for sure, but they were able to hang on by a thread. Meet your match cut that thread. The server browser was buried even further down the main menu, which didn't even show Valve servers anymore, so player-run servers couldn't hope for a shred of visibility from the players looking for Valve servers. Community servers were reporting player drops as high as 70% in the weeks following this update. If casual was so bad and community servers were so great, why didn't people simply play more community servers? The demand was right there. What stopped people from filling up the empty servers and making new ones? It was the same issue that I'd explained when QuickPlay first started defaulting to Valve-only servers. The phenomenon of a few servers being completely full amidst a sea of empty ones. Doesn't matter if there's 100, 1,000, 10,000 people all looking at the server browser, when the only servers they're trying to get into are the full ones. They'll fight over who gets into that full server next without realizing that they could all fill up an empty server and start playing now. Because unlike QuickPlay, players can't see other players if they're not already in a server. The very least Valve could have done was kept QuickPlay just for community servers. QuickPlay sucked, I've made that very clear by now. But it was at least something other than the server browser. If you wanted to play TF2 as you remembered it, the TF2 where you could play for 5 minutes or 5 hours, the TF2 that stood as the last bastion of old-school online multiplayer, well, you couldn't. What was especially chilling was that unlike other updates with rough first days, most of Meet Your Match's issues were by design. Everything was working as Valve intended. A rushed, half-baked competitive, a 12v12 competitive light, and the death of community servers. July 7th was a rough day to be a TF2 fan, there's no denying that. Was TF2 dead for good? Ha, nah, it was gonna take more than that to kill this game. But it was bleeding out fast. People were starting to lose hope for the future of this game, and were leaving in droves. On July 8th, the day after Meet Your Match's launch, Valve would make a sobering post on their blog. No witty jokes, no sarcasm, just acknowledging the fact of the matter. Day 1 was indeed rough, and fixing it wouldn't be easy. Valve had just dug themselves into a hole. Their top priority was fixing competitive matchmaking. They'd already spent 2 years working on it, it was the entire point of the update, and the pressure to provide a feature that was now standard for a modern game was mounting. But, out of nowhere, they had given themselves a second major problem: casual. A sensible option would have been to revert casual back to quick play while they shifted all of their focus to fixing competitive. Interest in competitive was dwindling, but it wasn't gone. It could recover. Once comp was in a healthy state, Valve could re-examine casual. Maybe they'd decide to stick with quick play and continue improving it, or maybe they'd try casual a second time. Valve didn't choose this option. Instead, they doubled down. Casual was staying, and they were going to work on fixing it alongside competitive. Not the best idea, given how historically small and slow the TF team was. The day this blog post was made, the abandonment penalty was removed from casual, and players would now only need to pick one game mode instead of two. A week later, vote kicks were re-added, stopwatch mode was removed, and players could queue for specific maps. 2 weeks after that, casual matches could start with less than 24 players. Notice how all of these changes being made to casual were re-adding things that community servers already had. Really makes you think what the point of casual was in the first place. On August 15th, Pyro was announced as the winner. In September, Valve tried their best to strengthen casual's matchmaking, increasing its preference for putting parties against each other and distributing players to teams based on experience. These changes did not do much. One-sided stomps would continue to be a recurring theme in casual. September also saw casual gain a new rematch feature. Rather than being forced out at the end of a match, teams could vote for a rematch, which would be the same map with the same teams. No one actually did this. Did any of you actually get a single rematch when this was a thing? Why would the losing team vote to rematch if the teams were the same? They were probably just gonna lose again. All this did was show that in spite of everything, Valve was still really hesitant to let go of their comp light's vision for casual. Finally, in December, the rematch system was scrapped in favor for the map vote system that we have today. With it, players were finally granted the luxury of staying in a server for more than one match. Oh, and the maps in the map vote weren't even of the same game mode. They were basically random? Like, what? Also included in this update was a neutered autobalance system that, when teams were imbalanced, politely asked for volunteers and offered extra XP as a reward. Unsurprisingly, most people declined, and when someone did accept, they didn't do it for the XP. They did it because they felt like switching teams, something that had been a basic feature of pubs for 9 years. But okay, being forced out of a server after every match was the last glaring issue with casual. It only took 6 months, but casual was now in a somewhat acceptable state. As for competitive, progress was much slower. Valve made a post in August detailing their plans for a revamp to the ranking system, which would be shipped sometime in the near future. Okay, that was good. Competitive's dysfunctional ranking, where players struggled to rise the ranks, was a major contributor to Valve Comp feeling like nothing more than a 6v6 pub. The prospect of playing TF2 with and against players of your skill level had been a big part of what got people so excited in the first place. While this new rank system was in development, Valve would release a few more updates over the following months to tide players over. As of September, comp games would no longer auto-end if someone abandoned mid-match. A bot would now take their place. Not ideal, but again, Valve's just trying to buy some time. October 21st, Valve would add 2 new maps to the comp rotation, Badwater and Turbine. October 25th, Valve would remove Turbine from the comp rotation. For the second time, mind you. Seriously, what is it with them and Turbine? And that was basically all Valve had done for comp by the end of 2016. Most of their development time had been spent fixing casual. By December, casual was finally in a decent spot. So now it was time for Valve to finish that new ranking system for comp, right? Nope. Neither comp nor casual would receive any more notable changes until October of 2017, over a year after Meet Your Match. Why? Because in addition to fixing comp and in addition to fixing casual, Valve also had to work on the Pyro update that they had promised. They were still deep in the hole that they'd dug for themselves. So they got to work, spending most of 2017 tackling all three issues at once. Valve was down, but they weren't out. Once October rolled around, however, there was an issue. Most of the Pyro update was complete. New weapons, an SFM short, maps, an entirely new contract campaign, really exciting stuff. But that new ranking system for competitive, the one that had been promised over a year ago, was still not done. Valve had two options: delay the Pyro update until the ranking system was done, or push the Pyro update out now and package the system with some future update. They chose the latter option, crossing their fingers and hoping that whatever excitement still remained for competitive would last just a little bit longer. Jungle Inferno released on October 20th, 2017. It had been 470 days since Meet Your Match, by far the longest gap between major updates up until this point. The update itself was solid. The new content was a lot of fun. The balance changes were mostly sensible, though many weapons were nerfed into uselessness. Casual and competitive both received a much-needed change. That dreaded lobby screen was removed, and you could now queue from anywhere. Friends that joined your party while you were already in a match could also now join that match, so you were no longer forced to re-queue like before. Yet, despite all of the work that was put into Jungle Inferno, the update was only a modest success. Concurrent player counts for October peaked at 84,000, which definitely wasn't anything to scoff at. Many who had left after Meet Your Match returned to check out the new update, but those players didn't stick around. Peak player counts would continue to drop in the months that followed, to as low as the 50,000s by February 2018, the lowest points in years. It was another major blow to Valve. They still weren't giving up though. They got back to work and released a massive update out of nowhere in March of 2018, the Blue Moon update. Alongside even more weapon rebalances, Casual got a few upgrades. The end of the map vote would now only include maps of the same game mode, with several maps that had inexplicably been missing now included. You could also now queue while already in a match, or have multiple queues running at the same time. The real star of the show, however, was the new competitive ranking system. It was finally done. The old matchmaking system was overhauled and replaced with one based on the Glyco system used in CSGO, a massive improvement. The previous 18 ranks were changed to 13 new ones, and everyone's rank was reset. Now, you had to play in placement matches before getting your rank, which would theoretically put you at a rank that was appropriate for you much faster than before. If this was the version of competitive that had launched back in 2016, it very likely would have flourished. The continued popularity of Uncletopia servers today proves that there are tons of players who want to play in an environment that's somewhere between mindless pubs and organized competitive. That's the gap that Valve Competitive was supposed to fill. There were still many issues that needed to be fixed, but this at least felt like a finished product. But it wasn't 2016 anymore, and it wasn't even 2017. This was over 600 days after Meet Your Match. During that span of time, Valve Comp had bled out and died. The excitement that was once shared by the entire player base was dead. There were plenty of people that checked out this new and improved competitive, but they were quickly reminded of all the other issues with the mode. Abandonment, cheaters, no class limits, and... is that Turbine? Why is it here again? Valve put it in comp for a third time, and this time they didn't even bother mentioning it in the patch notes. These were all issues that could have been excused at the mode's launch, but not now. Shortly after Blue Moon, Valve Comp returned to its status as a dead mode, and TF2's peak player counts continued to meander in the 50,000s. 4 years. Valve had spent 4 long years on competitive. It was all for nothing, and it was all their fault. This was the breaking point. Blue Moon was the moment that Valve threw their hands in the air and said, "Fuck this. They were done. They gave up. In the months that followed Blue Moon, the assumption was that Valve was hard at work on the next major update. It's safe to say now that this wasn't the case. Any signs of them working on something would have been spotted by players in the code, like in 2021 when rumors started spreading about an MVM update because some random lines of MVM code were changed. But aside from changing autobalance to stop asking for volunteers in May of 2018, just about every update that followed Blue Moon was nothing more than bug fixes and community-made content. Let that sink in for a moment. After over 10 years of constant development, constant innovation, constant updates, Valve just stopped. That's not them getting sidetracked by other projects. That's not them running low on ideas. No. That is a conscious decision to abandon this game and leave it on life support. I imagine Valve felt traumatized from the past several years of working on TF2. The pressure of trying to please everyone, trying to reshape the game to better fit the modern landscape, only for all of that effort to be in vain. They were content letting TF2 fade into obscurity, keeping the lights on so long as it still made them money. For most games, this would have been the end of the story. TF2 is not most games. What happened next was nothing short of a miracle. Okay, well, to address the elephant in the room, what happened after Blue Moon was anything but a miracle. With it becoming more and more apparent that Valve had largely abandoned TF2, hackers and bots were free to terrorize casual without any consequences. Valve only acknowledged the issue when it began to hurt their public image, and even then, their response was half-assed. Yet, despite this, the game just wouldn't die. Even in its darkest hours, when you could hardly even play the game, TF2 marched on. For a while, the only semblance of a content update TF2 received was Scream Fortress, and every single one of them saw a spike in player counts. All the players who had left because of Meet Your Match, or the death of community servers, or the neglect of the comp scene, or whatever other reason they had. Turns out, not all of them had truly quit. Their love for this game never died out. So when Scream Fortress rolled around, they checked it out for a chance to relive the glory days. This piqued Valve's interest. They still weren't going to make any content for the game, but if packaging community content was all it took to bring people back, maybe they could do more of that. The Smissmas updates that followed Blue Moon were nothing more than community case drops, no different than the summer updates. With Smissmas 2020, however, Valve tried something new. They released some wintry maps as part of a new seasonal event. And then, it happened. TF2, the 13-year-old game, broke its concurrent player count record, reaching a new high of 147,000. Was this spike just from trading bots farming the new case? That was part of it, I'm sure, but that alone wasn't the cause, because player counts remained high in the months that followed. Then, in 2021, that record was beaten again, now at just over 150,000. Well, Valve thought, if turning Smissmas into a seasonal event was such a success, how about doing the same for summer? Summer 2023, for the first time ever, came with yet another new seasonal event with even more maps. And yet again, the player count record was beaten. Not just beaten, it was smashed, going from 150,000 to 250,000. At the time of making this video, concurrent player counts regularly pass 100,000, which is nearly double what they were in the months that followed Blue Moon. How did this happen? How is this still happening? TF2 should be dead. It defies all logic. Well, player counts really started to pick up steam in 2020. Maybe people tried TF2 out during the COVID lockdowns and got hooked. There was also the Save TF2 movement of 2022, which spread well beyond the TF2 sphere into every corner of the internet. But in my eyes, there's one main reason why TF2 has seen a bit of a resurgence as of late. Even after all of Valve's missteps over the years, TF2 still stands tall as the last bastion of old-school multiplayer. It's still a game that respects your freedom as the player to play how you want. You can still play for 5 minutes or 5 hours. You can try your hardest or you can mess around. And as it turns out, games are more fun when you can play how you want to. This, ironically, was what Valve feared would make TF2 outdated, and it was what they tried to kill off in their pursuit of modern matchmaking, which has only revealed more and more flaws as time goes on. Valve nearly killed TF2, and thankfully they reverted some of their terrible decisions from Meet Your Match just before leaving the game in an endless limbo. That's not to say we've completely recovered from that fateful day, however. Far from it. Competitive mode nowadays lies as a rotting corpse on the main menu, a constant reminder of how hard Valve dropped the ball. As for casual, I know I've been badmouthing it for the past 30 minutes, but after all the changes made to it, I think that casual has the potential to be the ideal way to play TF2. It's convenient, has a clean modern presentation, and it has much of the freedom that old community servers offered. Where casual suffers is from running exclusively on Valve servers with barely functioning anti-cheat and no moderators. Had Meet Your Match not happened, we would have never had the bot problem, or at least not nearly to the same degree as what we've experienced. If your Valve server was ruined by a bunch of bots, whatever, there would have been a healthy supply of player-run servers to hop to instantly. In addition to bots and cheaters, there's major issue number 2, unbalanced games. This was common with community servers too, but the tools players had there for self-balancing made the issue significantly more bearable. With casual, it feels like at least half of the matches are one-sided stomps, and that's not fun for anyone. Just play community servers isn't a solution because they've got their fair share of problems as well. But remember, most of the issues with community servers today are a result of the removal of quick play. There not being enough vanilla servers only running the same few maps, servers either being completely full or completely empty, community servers only being played by people with thousands of hours. I love the convenience and variety of casual, but I also love the sense of community and higher quality matches of community servers. Yet there was a time when I could enjoy all of these things at the same time, the time before Meet Your Match, when there were hundreds if not thousands of servers on the browser to choose from, both Valve and player run. I could play on my favorite server with familiar faces or try out a random one with strangers. If I wasn't having a good time, it took 5 seconds to pull up the browser and hop into another server. And if I was having a good time, I could stay there for however long I wanted, and the other people who were also having a good time would do the same. Those days are now behind us. But even if Valve never makes another major update again, and even if they never fully fix the bot problem, there are still plenty of smaller changes they could make to help TF2 feel more like how it did during its first few years. Maybe they could let us spectate and switch teams on Valve servers again. They could redesign the server browser to not look like it's 2 decades old. They could let us find and join Valve servers from the browser again. Hell, they could even bring back quick play. Maybe with it only searching for player-run servers as an alternative to the browser. TF2's golden age is over, and it has been for a long time. But TF2's renaissance? That one's still up for grabs.